Hello, welcome on a Sunday morning. Here to see Melissa Benn. There's a few people, the teenage issues are very relevant at the moment, but there are a few people that are kind of qualified to speak about teenage issues, and particularly those pertaining to teenage girls, as Melissa Benn. She's a writer, she's a campaigner, she's a journalist, and she's also a mother of two teenage daughters, which obviously qualifies her above all else. She was named as one of the Feminist Writers of the Year in 1998, and we're going to put her through her paces today on about her book, which is called What to Tell Your Daughters, which comes highly recommended. My name is Chloe Combi. I'm also a writer, and my first book is coming out next year called Generation I. Obviously, if you have questions for Melissa, please do join in. Okay, so should we start? Are you ready?
Can I just ask you, what is Generation I, before you start asking me anything? What's your...
It's a book. I will be interviewing about, well, I'm in the process of interviewing 2,000 teenagers about all the kind of relevant issues to teenagers today. So sex, body, education, parents, and so on. So the whole thing kind of will be in their voices.
All right, so really we should be listening to you. Okay, sorry, I could talk to her all day, but I know that you'll... Carry on.
Okay, sorry. All right, starting with education, I suppose,
yeah.
Because the A-level results came out a few days ago.
Yeah.
Just a few things. How important do you think education is for girls at the moment?
Well, it's hugely important. And at the moment, it always has been hugely important. And one of the interesting things about education is I am quite critical about a lot of the ways that education has developed in the past few years. But when you take a wider view or a global view, think of the young woman who was shot, Malala. You know, when in fact, when my daughters, who are now 20 and 17, have just gone through the school system, we're finished with it, thank goodness. You know, they would say, about work or whatever, and I would say, look, there are girls in other countries who are fighting for the right for education. So I think that's an incredibly important reminder of how vital it is. And of course, girls have done very, very well in education. They're ahead of boys, although the figures this year are slight, you know, they change every year. Mm. But I mean, the simple answer to your question is, how can it be anything but very important? Mm. Although a qualification to that, one, is I think one of the problems with our views about education is that we have this idea, and I think Michael Gove in England has, well, he's gone now, but let's not get going on Michael. Actually, let's get going on a bit later. But this idea that everything is done at 18, and also that everything is about, in Goveland, the government, I call them, it's all about getting to good universities and so on. I have this, you know, lifelong education is incredibly important. And I think if you can inculcate in anyone, a girl or a boy, a love of learning, that seems to me a successful outcome, because you're, you know, at 18, you've got how many years to go? You've got 50, 60 or whatever. Anyway.
So it's kind of an ongoing process.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a life process.
Absolutely. And just kind of, I suppose, segueing from that, you know, regarding the ongoing debate versus kind of single sex and co-ed sort of education, what do you think, I mean, what do you think girls, I mean, is there one that girls benefit in more? Or
well, if you look at all the research, and I look at it in the book, it's clear that there is a marginal academic advantage to girls in single-sex education. But of course, a lot of that is because many single-sex schools are selective in some way or other. Personally, I think there are huge advantages in co-education socially. Having said that, I'm afraid the whole morning is going to be like this. Everything I think is very complicated. Having said that, I think our school system doesn't particularly do well by girls in some respects or by boys. And of course, there is also this huge class problem.
Absolutely.
So
do you think that's kind of the bigger issue, not so much perhaps the gender, but
for me, it's one of the big issues that we still have failed to educate poorer children. And of course, one of the arguments between the government and others is that they believe the answer was all the changes that they've brought in, you know, free schools and academies, and this very, what they would say is a knowledge-based curriculum. Well, nobody can be against a knowledge-based curriculum, but I think there's a sort of rigidity and aridity about the kind of schooling they want to impose, and I think poorer children will not benefit from that. But let's go back to the girls, single sex. I didn't want my daughters to go to a single sex school.
For what reason?
I think girls together can be tricky.
Yeah.
But then I think girls together can be tricky. I had quite a difficult teen. I've got 3 brothers, and that was interesting, growing up with 3 brothers. But girls made me quite miserable when I was a teenager.
Actually, that was a question I was going to ask a bit later, but I kind of had this rigid order, but I'm going to skip it. One of the things that's been clear to me in interviewing the kids for Generation I is it seems to me one of the most contentious issues in girls' lives is actually their relationship with other girls.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a new thing, but why do you think girls make it so difficult for each other? Why do you think that they're so determined to be so challenging and contentious with each other?
I don't, how can I answer that question? But I don't think girls set out to do that. I think there's something about vast generalisation, the way girls relate to each other, that, you know, if you get 2, even you see it with middle-aged women, 2 women get together, they will find what they have in common, and that will be the turf on which they begin to explore their relationship, and that can create quite a nice and early feeling of intimacy. My perception is that for girls and women, it's where differences emerge that they're not so good at handling it. I mean, look, we all know teenage relationships with girls can go horribly wrong. But at the same time, and we'll come on to the pressure of appearance and weight and so on, at the same time, your teenage years are a chance, and I've seen this with my own daughters, to learn how to negotiate all that. And I don't mean to be very negative about single-sex schooling. I wanted my children, I'd had a co-education, I really enjoyed it. I think boys in the mix can dilute that single-sex intensity. On the other hand, they can throw in new problems, like competition for relationships and, you know, whatever. But let's be optimistic and say that also the teenage years, if things go right, and here I think parenting is terribly important, you learn how to deal with a girl who bullies you or you feel bullied by. You learn how to deal with not doing what the group does. And of course, for this generation now, they've got to learn to deal with all of this refracted through social media and Facebook and Tumblr and Instagram. And every time I think I've caught up with some social media thing, there's some new word coming into the household. You know, have you seen what X has done on, well, Instagram seems the current, you know. But I think that creates, I think there are some very positive and very negative things about social media.
Do you think, before we kind of go into that in detail, do you think that that tends to impact more heavily on girls? Because certainly, you know, there's been a lot of press recently on things like Twitter, things like, you know, slut shaming and very misogynistic comments and women being attacked. Do you think that's a kind of an experience? I mean, and obviously that's probably high-profile women, but do you think that's an experience that lots of females will experience? I
think the Twitter and attacks on women, including Mary Beard, a Cambridge academic, and some of the new feminists, I think that's slightly different. I think there is no question that women who put their head above the parapet can face the most hideous problems. I mean, I'll give you a small example that I've had. I've got a website where I just put up the articles that I've written, and a man started posting on my website and continuously. So it was a form of sort of social media stalking.
Sure.
And in the end, you know, the police have got involved, and it's just quite frightening. And that's a low-level example. But to go back to teenagers, I think there's no question that girls. My impression is that Facebook and Tumblr and all these things have more of an impact on girls.
Right. And I suppose not just girls, but certainly most teenagers will want to have some sort of social media profile, and most parents probably either wouldn't want to or perhaps aren't really even in a position to stop them. I mean, what kind of advice would you give to maybe make that a bit more of a sort of safe or certainly stress-free experience?
Well, I think that's really difficult. I mean, my girls were growing up just as all this stuff was coming in, and my experience was it was a continual attempt to put the brake on it and failing. So, you know, there's no way you're having a mobile phone till you're in year X. Oh, okay, all your friends have got a mobile phone, all right. There's no way you're going on this thing called Facebook. You know, oh, okay, but only on a Thursday between 8 and 9, you know. Now, I mean, you know, every parent knows that there's always a mother in the locality who really does enforce all rules, and I spent my life feeling envious of those mothers who really didn't allow their children anything. But, you know, I sort of tried to be, you know, sensible boundaries and flexible. Anyway, this isn't about my parenting skills, but I have great sympathy with and it's interesting we say mothers, because really I think mothers are more involved with this. You know, if you think about it, the whole world comes into your living room, doesn't it? Through the laptop, you know, your children have got access to everything. And one of the things I feel sad about is that when I came home from school and I went to my bedroom, I could read a book, look out the window, you know, write my diary. There's a very interesting book by, I mention it in the book, there's a very interesting book by a sort of conservative American writer, Caitlin Flanagan, called Girlland, and she talks about the demise of the diary, because now when girls come in from school, they probably go upstairs with their laptop and they continue the relationships that they're having all during the day. And I think this is creating a kind of exhaustion, or that's the fear, and also a kind of narcissism that I don't like. That because everything in Facebook, a lot of it is about posting pictures and
beauty
and social events and so on. I think this must be very, very stressful.
I completely agree, and I wondered if you think that that's also being propelled by, aside from social media, for example, the tabloid press that's now online. Particularly, we all know about the Daily Mail and the sort of, you know, the sidebar of shame, where lots of underage girls in bikinis often appear. And do you think that there's a kind of a juxtaposition between those two? Do you think what one is kind of feeding into the other, this obsession with how you look and selfies and you know, showing the world, you know, and the most important thing being your physical appearance?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful. First of all, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I remember feeling incredibly sort of insecure and worried about, you know, spending far too long thinking I had fat thighs, you know, all that kind of thing. I just don't think things change that much. But I mean, talking about the Daily Mail, I mean, actually, the article that really offended me recently from the Mail, I know what the sidebar of shame is, and it's just sort of pop nonsense, but it was a piece about all the new Tory women in the cabinet, and but there was quite a lot of discussion about it. So there were 8 of them, and they were all pictured going into Downing Street, and then there was a little commentary at the bottom about what they were wearing. And the thing was, everybody said, oh, why concentrate on what they're wearing, they're politicians and so on. But true. But what really struck me was that every single one, they criticised what they're wearing. This looks like she's going to a dinner party. This is too boring. These trousers don't match this jacket. And I thought, how can any young women or any of us feel good about how we look when we're in a culture that just basically says, and the Daily Mail is the biggest selling newspaper, that says that you get it wrong all the time. So it's something that runs all the way through. And I mean, let's not even get on to the way middle-aged women are treated, you know. What? Let's. Yeah, well, actually, let's. But I mean, you see, in the book, I say there's this kind of continuum in all of these things, because the way our daughters feel about themselves, is very related to how they've been raised by us as mothers and the example we set. But also, you know, our daughters look ahead and see what's coming up in the lives of their mothers and their aunts and so on. And when you think that most women over 50, so what's the figure? It's absolutely shocking. Half of all women over 50 earn less than £10,000 a year. Anyway, if you look at the wage graph, it goes up, 20s, 30s, of course, motherhood, it starts going down, and then older women are relatively very, very poor. Our daughters are picking up these messages, and our daughters are also picking up the message that there is an elite who are going to do very well, who the sort of Gove stars, and then there's a majority that are going to go on to have the lives of ordinary women, low-paid work in care and catering and all those things. And I don't think that social and economic context comes into the discussion enough.
No, absolutely. I mean, and I suppose, again, as a sort of broader thing, I mean, even as long as, 10 or 15 years ago, I mean, do you think kind of girls currently, but, perhaps teenage girls currently are kind of better off or worse off than they were maybe even 10 or 15 years ago, kind of slightly pre all this obsession with social media and the media and so on?
I think it's complicated, that word again. I think there is an emphasis on girls' competence that is good. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that over the last decades girls have done better in education, although there may be reasons for that and there may be problems within that, I think it's good to have a sense of competence. I grew up in an era where I think it was, when I was at school, it was quite common for girls to not go off the rails, but adolescence was where you got obsessed with boys and preventing pregnancy and sex. And actually I was saved by my mother, who said, look, a lot of your contemporaries will give up on using their brain at this period. Don't do that. Carry on even though you don't want to, and you'll be glad later. And she was right. But I think with the culture has much more of a message in that has to be good. But one of the things I found interesting when I was looking at the female shape and how it's changed over the last 20 years, and I used the Kate Winslet in Titanic as an example. I think that came out in 1997. Yeah. And Kate Winslet, in the front with Leonardo DiCaprio. But she was a healthy size 12 then. And that was considered a reasonable body shape. If you look at what is now considered a reasonable body shape, it's probably a size 8. There's something about the female form publicly that has shrunk, and I think that's a complicated reaction to girls' increased competence. So it's a bit like backlash, being kept in check. So good things.
I mean, actually, that's interesting, because I did this thing recently where I showed some girls some images using Kate Winslet, but also some stars of the films of the 90s, like Alicia Silverstone in Clueless and Reese Witherspoon, I think, in Cruel Intentions. And most of the girls said that they thought they were kind of chunky or borderline fat. And this was, these weren't, there was quite a range of girls, and I kind of wondered if this is kind of a new form of kind of oppression of girls, like literally physically trying to reduce their space.
Yeah.
And they, I mean, there were, and these girls do have these. I wondered apart from that, why you think these kind of ferocious parameters about kind of the perceived thinness why is it so much worse?
I think your analysis makes sense. It's don't take up too much space. And one of the things that's depressed me about watching a cohort of girls grow up, and it will always change, but the cohort that I understand from the inside as a parent, is girls have a problem taking up space. And they also tend to police other girls who, there's always going to be one or two girls in a group that do speak out.
Break that mould, absolutely. Yeah.
Who are braver, who are unconventional, who don't care. And of course, as a parent, I would always say, isn't that great that X just doesn't care? That she will get up and speak to a whole assembly about, I don't know, coming out as gay, or the fact that she wants to be a vet or something. And then all these slightly more conventional girls would go, oh no, and you could see, and what depressed me about that is that they're shrinking themselves. And why is that? I don't know.
Again, it seems to me there's also kind of, and we talked about this about the porn article I wrote, that there seems to be a kind of a double standard in language, that there's words that apply to boys that are kind of clearly complementary, and the same words that apply to girls clearly are kind of a mass criticism. This idea that girls are kind of like lively or vivacious or loud is somehow seen as a kind of a negative thing. Would you agree with that?
I don't think that's ever changed. I think that's always been like that. And I can remember work by early feminists in the 1970s, which was exactly about that a boy who was sexual was a player and a girl who was sexual was a slut. And nothing has changed. It's just magnified. And magnified with this terrible ability. I don't want to offend anyone, so I'll say it in vague sense, pictures of a sex act on social media, and the girl is doing something to the boy, and the girl is the one who is shamed.
Absolutely.
And it's just, how horrible a world is that? What are we doing to our girls?
Again, and I think that there's a sort of certain contribution, I don't know whether you agree, to this kind of explosion of internet pornography, because it's often, for the most part, it's very, very extreme, very violent, and probably 99% of the time the woman is obviously in the you know, the very sort of subjective position, let's say, and obviously teenagers are watching this. Do you think that that's kind of having a psychological impact on not just how girls see themselves, but how boys see girls?
Huge. I mean, in various ways, the figures now on depilation, how girls feel that they have to take off so much of their body hair. I think in America, there was some study done in America, and it's something like half of all girls or women between 18 and 22 in the last month have tried to strip virtually every bit of their body hair off them. I mean, that's a new thing. Article only yesterday, I think, in the Independent, talking about anal sex being an you know, on the rise, and girls being coerced into it, and that being something that comes from pornography. I mean, pornography is obviously a massive issue of our time.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the interesting things in terms of feminism and politics is that I remember 20 years ago there was the sort of anti-censorship people and the pro. Do you remember Mary Whitehouse? You know, so it's a sense of censorship being a rather right-wing fusty thing, and then there were the libertarians who tended to be part of second wave feminism. I think now there's more of a consensus across what you might call the Daily Mail through to the new feminism, saying this is a problem, we need to deal with it, and politicians accept that. What you do about it, I don't know. Because, to throw another complicated spanner in the works, I think one of the things we mustn't do, which is very easy to do, is say sexuality is very, very complex. We know that. Developing sexuality is very complex. One cannot help but feel frightened or anxious for one's growing teenage daughters, but you don't want to clamp down on it. You don't want the answer to be don't.
Yeah.
You just so what is the answer? You want to help them to be healthy sexual beings. And I think that's a really difficult job for parents and for culture.
I mean, if you could say, give 3 top tips on how to do that. I mean, could you
okay, I'll give you my one top tip. I did actually, in the book, I don't, it's not full of tips because it's more of analysis, but there are moments where I think I must try and be helpful here. So I talked to 4 mothers, interestingly again, who were involved in communication as their work, their job. And I said, and they spoke to me anonymously, and I quote them at some length, how did you deal with teaching your teenage girls about sex? And some were more frank than others, and others said books. You know, I mean, and I have to say, I think that's, I think it's quite a fraught thing to talk to your children directly about sex. For lots of, there's reasons why we're different generations, you know, and we're so close that they may not want to hear it from us, and it may be right that they don't hear it from us. I'm not a great advocate of the parents sitting there. Well, I think before puberty, I think information is very important, and I do think you should give it, and I think it doesn't have that edge before puberty because, frankly, before puberty, children are not understanding the role of pleasure in it, so it's easier. So I think Frank talked there, and some booklets on the bed and all that kind of thing is very, I'm being serious actually. And then in teenage years, there are good books. There was an amazing book from second wave feminism called Our Bodies, Ourselves, and it's a massive great tome, but it talks about, you know, important issues like, you know, masturbation and how not consensual sex and so on. And I think it's helpful to say to teenagers, look, here is a lot of information, you filter it in the way that you want to. Maybe that is something you do read when you come home from school, instead of going on the laptop and looking at Sidebar of Shame. So it's very important to get information over, but perhaps not necessarily directly. And can I just say something here about Caitlin Moran, you know, considered one of the great feminist writers of our time, and her book How to Be a Woman, I don't know if anybody's read it, but that's actually quite useful, I think, because it's very frank about sexuality. And her new novel apparently is, again, very frank about sexuality. So I'll be certainly giving those to all the teenagers that I know.
Sort of kind of turning that on its head, which I think is really interesting. One of the biggest selling books for teenagers of certainly the recent 5 or 6 years is obviously the Twilight series. Yeah. And one of the big sometimes criticisms of that book, that it's a kind of a metaphor for abstinence from sex, you know, because it's a vampire, he'll lose control and I don't know, and either bite her or have sex with her. I'm not sure which one's worse. And do you think that that's the popularity, the way girls particularly have kind of like, you know, bought into this? Do you think it's perhaps a sign that they're kind of sick of this hypersexualisation? There's sort of a kind of an anti-rebellion. And again, like the Hunger Games, my younger sisters are really into that, and there's barely a mention of sex in that. The whole thing is about kind of a strong young female character surviving, which I think is really interesting. I mean, the kind of the 50 Shades thing aside, which perhaps wasn't even really a teenage phenomenon, but do you think that sort of is telling us something about how teenagers are thinking or feeling? Whilst
I haven't read, my daughters read Twilight, they got into the Twilight zone, and then Hunger Games. And I mean, I think the absence of sexuality in it is interesting. It's probably just a relief. Yeah. It's a relief. I mean, first of all, good plotting, interesting stories. I mean, I think the Hunger Games particularly, it's about poverty and, isn't it? It's and conflict and killing. And, no, but I mean, I think, you know, I don't want to say banal things about fiction, but fiction is a way of negotiating the difficulties of your life in a safe way. And I'm sure that the absence of sex was maybe part of it. You could just say, okay, we're free of that. Of course, Stephanie Meyer, who wrote Twilight, is a Mormon, so she very deliberately did that. So yes, you may be right. The 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon, I think, is for it tends to be older.
I didn't know
women.
that many teenagers who got into it. Actually, I think that it was probably a bit too sort of.
But obviously, millions of women did. I mean, there was a phase where I couldn't go on a tube or a train, not just me, but any of it, and you know, people reading it, and quite openly, which I always thought was quite interesting.
And do you think perhaps again that was a kind of, I mean, because she's not a liberated character at all, and obviously she's quite young. I mean, do you think that's saying that said anything about particularly interesting about female sexuality, or do you think it was just a kind of a fashionable phenomenon that's kind of took off?
I really don't know. I'm quite fascinated by why that took off.
Yeah, because it's terrible.
I mean, you could come. What did you say?
Because it's terrible.
I know. But I mean, then everybody said it's so badly written. I'm afraid I haven't read it. I keep meaning to, but I don't know. Other things happen. And I don't know what it says.
But do you know
it must speak of some. Well, you know, maybe we should. You know, we've talked about pornography, and there is terrible stuff out there. But obviously, erotica is something else. Yeah. And there is a human need, or obviously curiosity to read about sexual experiences and so on, and that's fine. And so obviously, I've forgotten her name, whatever her name is, who wrote it, E.L. James, tapped into that. But maybe is there a female need for sort of a bit more excitement in life, and I don't know, maybe
more billionaires?
Yeah, exactly. I don't. Who knows?
Should we sort of ask if anyone wants to ask?
Definitely.
Does anyone want to ask any questions before we kind of get carried away? Is there any questions from the audience? Sorry, the gentleman here.
I am a father of 3 daughters, so I mean, I guess there are many things that occur to me along with things that you're saying. I thought I would ask though, my impression of having teenage daughters is that perhaps in the past some of the pressure that they were under in terms of having sex, having boyfriends, how they looked, maybe came from boys or from male-orientated sources. My impression these days is that the pressure actually comes from girls, and that a lot of this body image stuff is actually coming from other females and not necessarily just from males.
When you say just to clarify, before, do you mean when your children were, do you mean you've observed this over the raising of your own daughters, or do you mean you're looking at a different period and now you're seeing your own
I would
daughters?
say when I was young and when I was at school, I feel that there was more female solidarity perhaps than there is now for young girls at school.
That's interesting. I suppose I can't help thinking, I wonder if part of what you're observing is that when you were young, you were the boy, and so you were seeing girls from the outside, as it were, whereas now you're seeing your daughter's lives from the inside as a concerned father and understanding more the pressures are on girls. And it may have been that when you were a boy, girls that you were seeing as having solidarity were having pressures as well. So I know that sounds like a tricky answer, but I'm just trying to be really truthful, because my feeling is, observing my daughter's peer pressures and my own, is that they're remarkably similar.
Can I get
Yeah, no. Yeah, get
one example? I remember it was a reading event. It was a writer, Janice Galloway, who grew up during the course of the 70s, and she talked about her experience when the boys discovered this word frigid. And what fun that was for a young teenage girl to have to deal with that kind of pressure. And my experience now is it's actually girls who say to other girls that they're frigid if they won't have sex and if they don't have a boyfriend.
Yeah.
I think there is a degree of that. Certainly from the interviews I've done, I think that there is a.
She'll have
there is a. I think there is true that, but I think also, I think that probably the way boys and girls socialise has changed slightly, because I think maybe 20 years ago within a social circle, maybe you had kind of the alpha males, and now I think you really are seeing this kind of phenomenon of the alpha females in the group in some social groups, and in fact that they can often kind of run the group, and you do get these quite strong female leader of the packs, and I think that their influence can really impacts on kind of perhaps not the weaker girls in the pack, but probably the ones who are slightly kind of more submissive. And I do think you see signs of that. And certainly, again, you've seen the examples of girls being slut-shamed on Twitter. There was that girl in Ireland, the Slane girl, which I'm sure some of you heard about. And I think that the amount of criticism she probably got more things said to her by other girls than she did by boys. So I think you're not absolutely right to bring that up.
But my impression, there were always alpha females. I mean, there have always been groups of girls, and I mean, but culture reinforces that. I mean, Gossip Girl and things like that.
No, it's true.
And Mean Girls, that wonderful, wonderful film with, it's just the most amazing film about how hideous girls can be. I mean, it's parody.
It's a good book as well. I think that's actually well worth a read. It's called Queen Bees and Wannabes, and it's about kind of the hierarchies in high school. I think there was a lady up here who wants to ask a question.
I just wanted to support what the gentleman at the front was saying, actually, because I went to an all-girls grammar school. I was there till I was 18. I don't have children, but my niece is 16, and she goes to exactly the same school as I did. And I am surprised by the way that she talks about the groups of girls within her year group. And she defines them in two different groups, and there's one group that seem to have plenty of money, and whose parents have plenty of money, should I say, and have all the clothes and the holidays and the boyfriends, and they're very keen on involvement with sexual relationships. And my niece doesn't seem to belong in that group, but seems very happy. I want to stress that.
Yeah.
But I don't remember that at all, that feeling at all in the school when I was there. And I just find it interesting, because I think I'm backing up what you're saying and the man at the front is saying.
Are you saying that there's kind of a popular group and a less popular group, would you?
No, I think they're just different.
Right, okay.
And they have very different views and very different values and very different ways of behaving. And I just do not remember that at all in exactly the same school when I was there, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because I'm just wondering if that is a cultural change, that somehow there's more of an idea now of what a girl should be, and I know
it's definitely, I think it's
the long hair and the boyfriend and the running with a pack of girls, and
but also
more materialism. I think we're in a more materialistic cut. Yeah.
We've got loads of questions. There's a lady here and a gentleman there, and then so 1, 2, 3, and then. I think the lady, just raise your, the lady with the blue top.
Hi there. I'm just anxious we're self-consuming again. I think I agree that nothing much has changed. I've got 2 daughters. They experience the same things that I did when I was growing up, and I don't know whether, I felt very strongly when I went to university about feminism and equal rights and all the rest of it, and now my 20-year-old daughter has suddenly rediscovered that actually there are things that aren't very fair or very just, and that women's lives don't necessarily seem to have evolved enough. What can we do to change the exterior rather than endlessly looking at our interiors and our physical exteriors? What about the world and trying to make changes small and large.
Yeah, well, well, a number of things. One of the things I feel really strongly about, I talked earlier about that a daughter will look at her mother's lives. If you look at what most women earn, so there's the question about pay, equal pay. I mean, the figures are now going backwards, so we need to do something about that. I think one of the unsolved problems of gender inequality is about how we value in the marketplace care over other kinds of work. So that, you know, I think most women are still in care, catering, childcare, what are the...
teaching. Do you think women? Do you think a problem is the underrepresentation sort of women in the politics and business and actually kind of things maybe they're influencing policy, the media and just the output of things that are seen.
The thing about this question of the exterior world is in a way things don't really change. The same things need to be changed. I was a passionate feminist in the 1970s and I'm a passionate feminist now, and it feels like they're very similar issues. But every time I do talks like this, I often talk about women in politics, women in public life, women speaking out more, and then somebody will always come up to me and say, I really like my life. They will say, I'm like an ordinary woman, and I've had my family, I've had an interesting, I've had a good job. I don't want to succeed and be a star and be an elite. And the thing that's important about that is that we should be paying attention to what those jobs that are not the starry jobs earn, and people should be paid more. So the living wage seems to me something that would hugely change women's lives. I do think there's something about public life and speaking. I think girls are more reticent. And I don't mean, again, in a sort of Gove sense that everybody should be taught to public speak, but I think teaching girls at home and in school to say what they think and learn to hear it out in the world and learn to argue is a really important skill, which will help them when they develop and get older to fight for what they want. And I think that's something schools don't do a lot of. And I mean, you taught teenage girls. It's hard to get them to do that, but... Absolutely.
And I do think that's true. And I think this idea of not being vocal and being quiet. And I think there's always been this kind of complicit encouragement of girls to communicate secretly, which and sort of say things kind of in whispers and kind of behind sometimes each other's backs. And then immediately that can kind of be translated as girls being bitchy, so then it's another kind of erosion of their self-esteem. So I think it's kind of quite a vicious cycle.
But can I go back to the exterior world again? I mean, most girls are going to be mothers, and we don't talk anymore about that feminist agenda, about how do we raise children together? How do we involve fathers more? My experience is that fathers are much more involved in their daughters' psychological and growing lives than a generation before, but something about the pattern of work still makes it hard to share the care, and something gets set up early on which means that women take the load, and then that has implications for them. I think we have to be careful not to say that care is a problem. I mean, actually care is at the heart of what our society should be. So we don't want to say, look, all women, we need to get them away from raising their children, because the truth is that most women, when they have children, they want to be with them, but then a lot of fathers want to be with them more. All these kinds of exterior world things are very, very important, and I think would have an impact on teenage girls in the way that we're discussing it. If you come from a family where your father does the washing and the shopping and has worked less in order to spend time with you, I think you have a different orientation in the world. If you're in a family where your mother speaks her mind and is not a sort of 50s housewife, you're going to be a different sort of teenager. So those things are important. Women in public life there's a problem with women in public life. There's something about it doesn't quite work. But I also think there's a problem about elites in public life. I think we need many more different kinds of people in politics. And I think Westminster is really fast becoming a disaster in that respect. And I think the coalition government has made it much worse because they've made everything much worse. and then the final thing, which I feel really strongly about, is, you know, the benefits cuts, austerity. It's been a disaster. It's been an absolute disaster, and women have taken the hit. So that is where social questions come in with psychological questions. Because again, at school, you're talking about, I mean, in a grammar school, probably most of them are going to be relatively well off, because all the figures suggest that grammar schools, you know, but in most schools you're going to have girls who are coming from nothing and whose parents are struggling, or they're single parents, and then you're going to have girls who are heading for Russell Group universities and come from quite comfortable societies. These are very important divisions that play into all the things we're talking about. And we don't really talk about those things anymore. And we might come on to modern feminism, but I'm not sure feminism talks about those things much.
I do think that certainly Scottish State
Yeah.
they teach children and young people that there is equality.
Yeah.
They talk all about equalities on the basis that there is equality, and it's a big shock for them to find
When it is.
that it's not like that.
So you think they're in a way being taught something that is not true?
Yeah, they're being taught a theory of equality without examining the world around them. There's no context.
Yeah.
They're complacent when they go into the world.
Yeah, but you see, what's so interesting about that is that in the English school system, they've taken out every element of civic discussion. So you are taught that you shouldn't read Twilight, you should read Middlemarch, and that Shakespeare's the only one who's got anything to say, and there is, you know, climate change is some progressive fad that has no place in schools. So I have an envy about that equality is an element in your curriculum, but interesting to hear that it's not quite textured enough.
There's a lady there who, no, sorry, gentleman, where you on?
I don't know how long you want to spend on this, but I was brought up in the 50s, went to a single-sex grammar school, and I've watched feminism rise and support it. My observation would be that I've come across very few problems that women face that in some form or other men don't, and that leads to my question in a moment, and that is that as a seasoned campaigner, what advice would you give to the non-existent men's movement? Do you have to wait for awareness, or what? And finally, our gym master gave us very sound advice: always bite first.
Always bite first. As a seasoned campaigner, I've never heard that. What is that?
I was going back to your comments earlier about certain activities that we shouldn't talk about.
Okay, I'll pass over that one. Advice to a men's movement.
Can I?
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. No, could you what?
I was just maybe as a sort of adding to that. I'm sure lots of people here have teenage sons as well. Maybe as a kind of addendum to that question, what can we be teaching boys to do to help girls? Maybe that's a kind of another way of looking at, or you know, so it's a kind of a collaboration rather than. It seems to me there's a lot of working against each other.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I'd answer that by saying I always say to the parents of sons who are my daughter's age, my daughter's future depends on how you're raising your son.
Yeah.
You know, so when I see parents who have maybe 2 daughters and a son, and their daughters are doing the housework and their sons are being let off, I know that that's going to cause problems for my notional daughter, who's going to be living with that person who thinks that that's her job. So that's one answer. I don't know, the men's movement is a complex web, and there are more aggressive elements of it who are hostile to, you know, legal changes and so on, and then there are men who really want to be part of something. And my impression is a lot of young men who've been raised perhaps in more equal partnerships are very on board with feminism. I think it's probably about speaking out when you see things. I mean, I think it's left to women to speak out against a lot of these things, and you need men to stand up against slut-shaming.
Absolutely. I thought it was quite powerful in India after that terrible rape of that woman on the bus, and I think one of the really provoking images was how many men were protesting. And this isn't in particularly a country that's necessarily enjoys that much equality, and I think that was a really powerful image, seeing all those men really angry about, you know, this kind of terrible abuse that women have been suffering, and it was important.
Well, what India's had an amazing revolution about sexual violence because of that terrible case, the Delhi case, which just is so awful, and then there's so many like that. They're really facing this, and because of global information, we know about that. But another thing I would say, just in answer to your question, is I don't know if you've seen, there's an amazing video, I think, about domestic violence with President Obama and lots of men who speak out about it, and it is extraordinary, the force of that, to have a man who runs the most powerful country in the world saying it is not acceptable. Now that is the impact of feminism, and I think we have to remember that feminism has had a huge impact over the last 50 or 60 years, and we should celebrate that. It's not perfect, but it has changed things. Yeah. I can't hear.
Sorry, we've got very little time, so I'm just going to move on here.
I'm speaking out. I think it's my turn.
Yeah.
I'm a granny with one daughter and 3 granddaughters. You've spoken a lot about the problems when they're teenagers. I think some things have changed a lot. When I was first pregnant in the early 60s, a woman said, "You want to have your cake and eat it," when I wanted to be doing a bit of work as well as looking after the child. I think that attitude's changed. We are expected to do a bit of both. You've talked about caring as the problem. I see work as the problem for women particularly, but men also, that the timing of work should be more flexible, and the expectation of experience, like bringing up children, but maybe whatever, ought to be more valued.
Yeah.
I hope you agree.
I hope I did say I don't want caring to be the problem. I think I did say that. No, and I completely... let's let your comment stand, because I agree with that.
It's the lady here.
I'd like to start by a public invitation to the chap at the back. I'm happy to talk to him over lunch about the way I've been discriminated against at home, being raised vis-à-vis my brothers, in the workplace, as a barrister, and in society in general. As an obvious example, there would not be a media campaign about men eating on the tube. There would, for obvious reasons, not be a media campaign about women breastfeeding in public. How very dare they? But he has a point. The chap at the back is saying, what about men? Well, I turn it around to this. What about getting men on board? They are better advocates for feminism than feminists. I don't consider myself a feminist. I believe in equal opportunities for women. Does that make me a feminist, or does it make me a normal person in the United Kingdom? No, I don't think it does. I think it makes me a normal human being. And I think the men in here should believe in equal opportunities for women. Does that make them a feminist, or does it make them a normal human being?
I'm kind of just processing what you said. To me, you are a feminist, but can I just put to you the idea that maybe feminism has become, put feminism in Google, and you would think it was Al Qaeda. It's a very, I did a talk with the ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, about feminism and marriage. Put feminism and marriage in Google, and it says, has feminism ruined marriages? Feminism ruins all relations. Feminism has a very, very negative label in mainstream culture, and remember, we've only had the vote for sort of 87 years or something. Feminists have changed the world, and I think we should stay on side with them. So I agree with everything you say, except that you won't call yourself a feminist, and it may be because it's considered too political a thing in a still unequal world. So I feel enjoyably confused by your contribution, but basically think that we're on the same side.
I will actually say that, just to respond to that, as a kind of a general thing, that again, interviewing lots and lots of kids, and I do say to them all, but particularly the boys, who would you say wears the trousers, who's the boss in the house? And most of the time they go, well, mum. So, yeah. So that I don't know whether you'd consider that to be a positive thing, but that seems to be almost universal. And they look at you like you're kind of mad. There's a lady up here with a question.
Hello. Hello, I'm a mother of 2 teenage girls and a teenage boy, and I'm also a teacher in the Scottish Comprehensive System. And what I would just like to give a little shout out for teenage boys, because a lot of the anxieties you were describing in teenage girls are things that many teenage boys feel, that they have issues with body image, that they have issues with friendship, social media. All these things affect them, and I think sometimes this kind of feminist discourse is just a way of looking at people, a way of almost like boxing people in, and that I think first of all we should look at people as human beings and individuals, rather than saying you're behaving this way because you're a girl or you're behaving this way because you're a boy. I think it's just, it can sometimes become too generalised, and I think my experience with my own children and children that I teach is that boys just have as many issues, just as many problems.
But can I, without wanting, to take away from your sort of human argument, I think there are problems that girls face that boys don't. I mean, if you just look just at sort of isolated statistics that surprise me, a young man and a young woman go to the same university, get the same degree, they go into their first job, the young man is likely to be appointed to a higher starting salary. That is just structural discrimination. They're both decent people who might have problems of, and I've, in family life, looking at the figures, it's in a family where a mother and a father live together and there's a son and a daughter, it's most likely the daughter will do more domestic labour. That's just a structural thing. It's nothing about the decency or problems of the people involved, and it's that kind of thing. And when you mention it, I mean, I was interested in what you said about growing up in your family, and there's obviously a sort of anger there, or maybe I'll join you for lunch. But this is structural discrimination.
But why is it that young men are the highest suicide rate? Why is it? You talk about female silence, but I think there's male silence as well.
I don't disagree with that.
And there's a difficulty for young men to express their difficulties as well.
Can I say something I observe as a late middle-aged woman, is that women have massive advantages in terms of the communication that begins in being able to talk about things. And I think also female friendship changes over a lifetime. I think by the time you get massive generalisation, and by the time you get into your older life, your friends, you're not dealing with those same issues at all, and your friends are the people you can talk honestly to, and it is a lifesaver, and I think men often don't have that.
Do you think boys and men's emotional health sometimes quite dependent, I'll go quickly, on their female relationships? Do you think that's quite an important feature?
Boys or men's?
I would say more boys. I mean, there's so much to say. In fact, I won't go on. I'll let this lady comment.
Oh, hi there. Actually, going on from what you've just said about as you get older, you have a really good sort of group of friends. I'm writing a play with my mum at the moment, who's kind of mid-menopause. And it's really interesting talking to her, because I feel, going on what a few people have already said, that a huge amount of pressure these days comes from other women. And I've been talking to my mum, and she doesn't feel like that. Yeah. And certainly not now with all her great mates, that sort of thing. But I really feel that when it comes to career, body image, boyfriends, money, so much kind of external judgment comes from other women, and I find that really sad.
Can I say something we haven't really made explicit, which is that 30 years ago, a woman was not expected to go into the workforce and do well, and now there is this added pressure about succeeding in education and in work. Not everybody feels it, and it's a class-based thing, but if you add that, so succeeding in doing, A-star culture, as I discussed it, doing well in work, having a family, but going back to work, those kind of pressures, that is a massive amount of new pressure piled on women, which maybe your mother's generation, didn't have.
sort of trying to find our feet within those changes. But I do really feel, does anyone else feel the same way? Yes?
Do you think, I might be wrong, but are you kind of saying that also that looks, there's pressure on women, that also, you know, what should it matter what an MP looks like, or what an author looks like, or what a politician looks like? She's not there on the basis of her looks, and yet that's become this thing that's become, in a way, the most significant thing, which is a really, really, would you agree, ridiculous situation?
Yeah, I think women are judged in their looks in a way. That is another thing to answer, you know, very taken with what the mother of sons says, because I don't think it's about being against young men at all. But I think women are judged on their appearance.
Do you think more so now than they were, say, 30 years ago?
Well, I think there's the media has grown massively, you know, and also, I mean, I think there is something quite scary about the internet. You know, one hideous picture of you as an author is going to be going around the world, you know, and I mean, I just think the pressures are greater.
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit about women supporting each other. I brought my kids to a show yesterday in the festival. My son is 6 and my daughter's 4, so they're very young. And in the show, it was quite scary. They brought a little girl on stage, and she didn't want to do what she was asked to do. And the presenter of the show said, "Oh, do we have to get a boy up here to do this?" Yeah. And as a mother sat there with my son and my daughter, I was just disgusted that this seemed okay for the female presenter of the show to say that to an audience of 6, 7, 8-year-olds. Well, no, it was a really large show, so nobody said anything.
You know what my answer to that would be? Some of the things that have most offended and wounded and worried me when I was younger were these kind of careless remarks. Yeah. And they're careless remarks that are like the bubbles on the surface of much, much deeper things. Yeah. But can I say another thing, because I want to be optimistic? I've got 2 things I really do want to say. You asked me about laptops and things like that. And do you know the advice? If I could go back with my children, I would say, you can't stop the growth of media or whatever, but I would say, I tried to do this, but you know, at 8:30 at night, we shut off all these devices. I've never let them have them in their bedroom, actually. And we just... not we sit and read Dickens, but you know, the other thing I think is really important is all eating together, because I think that is where some of the most articulate women that I interviewed came from large Catholic working class families, and some of them said that their father would say, "Read the paper before dinner and I will question you on something in the Times." I mean, Michael Gove would have absolutely loved it. And in fact, one of them ended up as a trade union leader, Mary Boosted. She's great, and that's where you learn to converse. That's the first thing. Turn off all electronic devices as early as you can and have some. That's the second thing. And then there was something else I was going to say and I've forgotten, but I'm trying to be.
Oh, so many questions.
And the example of the mother. Your example as a mother is the most important thing to your teenage daughter.
Okay, so we're actually all out of time.
Yes, but no, I'm thinking examples. There is something about a mother. You know, if I as a mother have friends and I which I do, and I make time for my friends, and I might discuss, not in a kind of devious way, I find that difficult, but we sorted that out, I forgave my friend for that, or so on. All those things go in to the sea of self. You see it when I look at the daughters that my children grew up with. They are all very like their mothers.
Well, thank you so much for all your participation. Can we, I mean, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. Could we all give Melissa Benn a massive round of applause?
Loving it. We come every year. We've been coming now for about 10 years up from Cheshire, and we just love the atmosphere generally and attending the events we can, although it's slightly hampered now by having 2 very small children, so we just take it in turns. Melissa Benn's event was really, really interesting. It's given me food for thought. It's made me think about the differences between raising a son and raising a daughter and the different pressures that there may be involved as well. And I particularly like the question and answer session at the end, where people get to say what they think and ask the questions of Miss Benn. I think authors generally come out of themselves a bit more when they're put under pressure from the crowds, and it's interesting to hear other people's views in the audience as well as to how they've experienced things for themselves.
I'm really enjoying it. This is my, I think it's my 5th talk this week so far. I thought it was really informative and really interesting, and it's followed on from the other talk I went to see about feminism, so it was another good talk. Yeah. The highlight of the talk was I think, helping me to understand even more how to best be with my daughter who's aged 12, and I just want to be the best mother that I can be for her with this really important transitional time that she's about to go through.
It's been wonderful. It's really good. It's really interesting. Yeah, it's a lovely place to be. So
I love coming to the book festival. It's just like a wee oasis of like-minded folk right in the heart of the city. It's great. That was incredible, Melissa's event, wasn't it? It was so empowering, and funnily enough you come out with the confidence of your beliefs and just reminding you to keep on being a role model.
Yeah, it's so relevant. It's so nice to feel like you're not just the only one who kind of feels that way. It's really good to have a whole tent full of women who are sort of who understand like why you're frustrated with the way things are. It's great. It's really good. It's lovely to be here. A few of the questions that people in the audience asked were they were really things that like I personally wanted to know, and it was great to sort of hear somebody else's view on that and have somebody give an answer that made a lot of sense. It was great.
I think to be reminded that in the Scottish education system, which is wonderful, and we are taught about equality, and you go through it feeling equal and you come out it feeling equal, and we do need to be reminded that the world just isn't equal, and that was interesting to talk about that today. So just to keep on standing up for what you believe in.
We always like to come to the book festival. We tend to come every year to it, so it's always good, always interesting events. Today we went to the Melissa Benn event this morning. Yes, we enjoyed it.
It was really lively. Lots of questions, lots of audience participation.
A good discussion afterwards as well. We have daughters, so and they're kind of at that teenage stage, or kind of becoming young women, and so it's a very relevant topic of discussion to us. So really just the whole discussion I think was interesting. It kind of gave us a lot to think about, and we were able to participate a little bit in the discussion as well, which was good.